The truck was gone. Lorna Ashcroft stood in the doorway of Dorsey's Fuel and Feed with a paper cup of coffee in each hand and looked at the empty space where her husband's truck had been parked 4 minutes earlier. Not moved, not repositioned by the pumps. Gone. She had no phone. It was charging on the kitchen counter 40 miles behind her. She had no wallet. It was in the bag on the back seat of a truck that was no longer here. What she had was a wool coat that had been warm enough in the house and was not warm enough out here. A pair of walking shoes meant for grocery runs. And 2 cups of coffee she'd just paid for with the last $4 in her pocket. Second Tuesday of November. That flat gray cold that comes before the first real snow. The kind that doesn't bite so much as settle into you and stay. Lorna Ashcroft had turned 55 in March. She stood there for what felt like a long time and was probably 30 seconds. Then she set one of the coffees down on the concrete ledge by the door. Because there was nobody to give it to now. And she started to think. Not about why. Lorna already knew why. Here's the thing about a woman who has spent her whole life holding things together. She gets very good at it. So good that people stop noticing it's happening. So good that the holding becomes invisible, becomes weather, becomes the floor everyone walks on, without ever once looking down. And then one day somebody pulls the floor up and drives away with it and expects her to fall. Lorna did not fall. She picked up the remaining coffee. She wrapped both hands around it. And she turned back into the store. The kid behind the counter was maybe 19. Buzzed hair, hoodie under a work vest, the specific slouch of someone 4 hours into an 8-hour shift with nothing to do. He'd rung her up 2 minutes ago. He looked up when the bell over the door jangled. Forget something? My husband. He blinked. He left, she said. In the truck. Just now. Like, left. I believe so. The kid came out from behind the counter, walked to the window, looked at the empty parking spot the way you check a math problem you were sure you got right. Ha, he said. Yes. You want me to call somebody? And here's where it got interesting, because Lorna opened her mouth to say yes, please call my son, and then she closed it again. Tobin was 90 minutes away in Bowling Green. Cordelia was in Louisville. Merritt was somewhere outside Elizabethtown, with 2 kids under 7 and a wife who'd never once called Lorna by her first name. None of them had liked Vaughn, which would have been fine, which would have been useful, actually, if their solution to not liking Vaughn hadn't been to back slowly away from their mother like she was something contagious. 9 years of that. 9 years of Christmas cards and 40-minute phone calls and a very careful distance that everyone agreed not to name. She could call them, and then she'd stand in this gas station for 2 hours waiting to find out which one of them was going to make the other 2 do it. No, she said. Thank you. You sure? Because it's like, he gestured at the window, at the gray, at the general situation. Cold. I'm aware. He nodded slowly. Then he squinted at her. Hang on. You paid cash. But he shook his head like he was clearing it. What's your name? Lorna Ashcroft. No, but before. Like before. She looked at him. Halloway, she said. And the kid's whole face changed. Halloway like Halloway Ridge? That's my grandfather's farm. Okay. So this is weird. He was talking faster now. Because there was guys in here. Last week. Tuesday, maybe Wednesday. 3 of them pick up with a bunch of, those orange flag things? On sticks. Something in Lorna's chest went very quiet. Survey stakes. Yeah, those. They bought like 6 waters and asked me how to get up to the Halloway place off the county road. He shrugged. I told him, I've been up that way, but I thought that place was abandoned. Yeah, 20 years, my dad says. Lorna set the coffee down on the counter, very carefully, because her hand had started doing something she didn't want anybody to see. 20 years. That was right. Silas had gone down on the porch steps in the fall of 2005 and broken his hip, and he'd never gone back, and the house had stood empty from that day forward. She'd driven past the gate maybe twice since. Never stopped. There was a family trust and a lawyer, and a whole tangle of arrangements nobody had ever untied, and Lorna had told herself it wasn't hers to untangle. Surveyors. Somebody was measuring her grandfather's land. "Ma'am? You okay?" "How far is it?" she said. "From here. To the farm." He pulled out his phone, thumbed at it, frowned. 20 miles? Little under, if you cut down the old mill road instead of staying on 12. 20 miles. Lorna did the arithmetic she'd been doing her whole life. The one where you don't ask whether you can. You ask how long and what it costs and whether there's another option. There wasn't another option. That was the thing about the position Vaughn had put her in. It was elegant. She'd give him that. He hadn't needed a conversation. He hadn't needed to explain himself, or raise his voice, or look at her. While he did it, he just opened a door and let the math do the rest. 6 hours, she said. Give or take. 6 hours? Ma'am, no. Let me call. What's your name? Des. Des. She buttoned her coat to the top. Do you have a garbage bag? He gave her a garbage bag which she folded into a square and tucked inside her coat against her back, because plastic against your spine holds heat, and Silas Halloway had taught her that in 1981 when she was 11 years old and stubborn about wearing a scarf. He gave her a bottle of water, off the shelf, didn't ring it up, and then he did something she'd think about later in the dark, when she was too tired to think about anything else. He walked her out, to the edge of the lot, and he stood there with his hands in his vest pockets, while she started down the shoulder of Highway 12. He didn't wave. He just watched until she was small. 40 years ago she would have cried. She didn't cry. She was 55 and she'd been through enough that being abandoned at a gas station, while genuinely terrible, was something her body knew how to process, without any theatrics whatsoever. The shoulder was gravel, then gravel and dead grass, then a drainage ditch and a fence line, and a harvested cornfield running brown, and stripped all the way to the treeline. A semi went past, and the drag of it pushed her half a step sideways. She steadied herself. She kept walking. 9 years, she thought. 9 years, and he couldn't say it to my face. But that wasn't fair, was it? Because that was exactly Vaughn. That was Vaughn in a single frame. Present enough that you couldn't call him absent. Useless enough that it made no difference either way. She'd married him at 46. After Emmett. After the funeral and the casseroles and the 2 years of telling herself she was fine alone, and the 4 months of understanding that she wasn't. Emmett Ashcroft had died in his armchair on an ordinary Wednesday evening, with the television on. 58 years old. A man who remembered small details about people he'd met once. Who fixed things without being asked and never mentioned that he'd fixed them. 30 years of marriage, and he went in the time it takes to set down a cup. And the floor had gone out from under her life. Not just the grief, though God, the grief. The practical part. Emmett had handled the money. The house was almost paid off. His pension was smaller than she'd understood it to be. She was 44 with a part-time bookkeeping job and a roof that needed replacing and 3 grown children, who were kind at the funeral, and then went back to their lives at the speed people do. She sold the house 2 years later. Her children had opinions about that. She made the decision anyway, because they weren't the ones lying awake at 2 in the morning doing the arithmetic on how long the savings would hold. And then a church potluck. And a man in a good jacket who remembered that she'd mentioned liking pears. Vaughn Prentice owned an equipment repair shop in Cauldwell Hollow. Paid his bills on time. Never raised his voice. At 46, that had felt like enough. She'd been so tired by then. Tired of struggling. Tired of being the one who figured everything out. Tired of carrying a whole household on shoulders that had stopped getting any younger. And here was the thing she hadn't understood at 46, that she understood completely at 55. There is a certain kind of man who mistakes a tired woman for a grateful one. 2 miles. Her feet were beginning to register a complaint. Not pain exactly. Just a persistent editorial position about the difference between shoes designed for parking lots and shoes designed for this. She ignored it. The wind had teeth on the open stretch by the Vernon place, so she turned her collar up and put her chin down and kept her eyes about 10 feet ahead of her boots, which was a trick Silas had taught her to. Don't look at the hill. Look at the next step. The hill takes care of itself. She thought about the surveyors. 3 men, orange flags, asking directions in a gas station like it was nothing, which meant somebody thought they had the right to be up there, which meant somebody was going to sell it, which meant she stopped that thought where it stood, because she didn't have information yet, and Lorna Ashcroft had a very strict private rule about not building a house on a foundation she hadn't inspected. 20 miles. She'd walked farther than that as a girl, chasing goats off her grandfather's ridge. She kept walking. Mile 5, a truck slowed down. She heard it before she saw it. That drop in engine pitch. The crunch of tires easing toward the shoulder. Gray Silverado. Man in his 60s. Ball cap. He rolled the passenger window down maybe 4 inches, and looked at her the way people look at a situation they haven't decided about yet. You all right? Yes. Long way from anywhere out here. I know where I'm going. He looked at her some more, and she watched it happen, the little calculation behind his eyes. Woman alone. No car. Middle of nowhere. Something's wrong here, and if I get involved then it becomes mine. Okay then, he said. The window went up. The truck pulled off. And Lorna stood in the diesel exhaust, and watched him go, and felt something she hadn't expected, which was not anger. It was recognition, because that was the same Math Vaughn had run, the same one her children had run, the same one she had run herself, more times than she wanted to count, when somebody else's trouble came knocking, and she'd looked at her own tired hands and thought, not today. Everybody's doing arithmetic all the time, the whole world, constantly, and most of the time it comes out to not my problem. She started walking again. Mile 8, a woman came out of the Ridgemont grocery. Not a customer. The owner, judging by the apron, and the way she was carrying a case of soda like it had personally offended her. 50s, maybe. Gray streak at the temple. She set the case down on the walk and stood up and looked at Lorna coming along the shoulder. Lorna kept walking. The woman went inside. Lorna kept walking, and then the door banged, and the woman was jogging, actually jogging down the gravel with something in her hand. Hey, hey. Lorna stopped. The woman held out a bottle of water and a plastic-wrapped sandwich. I don't need. I didn't ask. They stood there. Lorna took it, and she waited for the questions. Where are you going? What happened? Do you need me to call someone? Are you all right, honey? She had answers ready. She'd been assembling them for 3 miles. The woman didn't ask any of them. She just nodded once, turned around, and walked back up to her case of soda. That was it. That was the entire interaction. And Lorna stood on the shoulder of a county road in November holding a ham sandwich, and found, to her considerable irritation, that this was the thing that finally got behind her ribs. Not the truck. Not the parking spot. A woman she'd never met, who asked her nothing. She ate the sandwich walking. Her grandfather had said it in the spring of 1995. She could put a date on it because it was the day after Tobin's 3rd birthday, and she'd driven up to Halloway Ridge with a plate of leftover cake, and Silas had been 78 and still climbing on things he had absolutely no business climbing on. They'd sat on the porch, cake on a chipped blue plate, and out of nowhere, out of nothing, out of a conversation about fence posts, the old man had reached over and taken her hand between both of his. His hands were like tree bark. She remembered that. Lorna. What? The gate will really be open when you need it. She'd laughed. She remembered laughing. The gate's always open, Grandpa. You never close it. That's not what I said. And he'd held on. That was the part. He'd held on and looked at her with that flat level gaze he had, the one that meant he was not being poetic, because Silas Halloway was never once in his 96 years poetic. When you see it open, he said, you walk through. You don't stand outside wondering if you're allowed. Allowed. Wondering. Standing there. Doing that thing you do. He let go of her hand. Picked up his fork. You walk through. She'd been 25. She'd filed it under things old people say that probably means something, and she'd finished her cake and she'd driven home. She had not thought about it again in 30 years. She thought about it now. Silas Halloway had raised her from the age of 9. Because in the fall of 1979, Lorna's mother drove to Lexington on a Friday afternoon and simply never drove back. No note, no phone call, no explanation that ever arrived, not in a week, not in a year, not in 46 years. And Silas had made no production of it whatsoever. He'd come to the school on Monday morning, signed whatever needed signing, moved her things out of the apartment in 2 trips in the bed of his truck, and set up the small bedroom off the kitchen with clean sheets and a lamp with a warm yellow bulb. "This is your room now," he'd said. That was the entire conversation about it. Ever. And even at 9, Lorna had understood that the absence of drama was itself a form of love. That some people say I've got you by saying nothing at all and simply making up the bed. 9 years on that ridge. She learned to drive a tractor before she learned to parallel park. Learned to read weather by the way the light changed over the eastern slope. Learned to set a fence post and doctor a sick heifer and build a meal out of what was actually in the kitchen instead of what a recipe assumed you had. He never called any of it teaching. It was just Tuesday. It was just what was happening. And she'd absorbed it the way children absorb the things that happen every single day. Mile 11. The light started going. November light doesn't fade. It drops. 1 minute you can see the fence line, and the next minute the fence line is a rumor. Her feet had moved past complaining into a kind of unified numbness that she decided to categorize as progress. 12 miles. 13. At the turnoff she found the old grain elevator still standing, which surprised her. It had been listing east the last time she saw it, timber frame slowly losing its argument with gravity, and she'd assumed by now it would have finished losing. It hadn't. It stood there at the intersection looking weathered and stubborn, which, given the day she was having, felt appropriate. She turned onto the county road, and everything changed. Highway 12 had trucks, noise, that aggressive purpose of a road that exists to move things from one place to another as fast as possible. The county road was different. Narrow, cracked asphalt, patched so many times across so many decades that it read like a geological record of municipal budgets. Maples on both sides past peak, still holding some red up in the high branches, and a creek running alongside that she could hear but couldn't see through the undergrowth. She'd walked this road hundreds of times as a girl. Down to the station for cold drinks in July, over to the Whitcomb place to return tools or deliver whatever Silas had put up in jars, past the one-room schoolhouse that got turned into a community hall sometime in the 70s and had been falling apart politely ever since. The road felt smaller than she remembered, which she knew was just the ordinary trick memory plays, making childhood places enormous and adult ones modest. The road hadn't changed. She had. The trees thinned on the left, and there was the long slope of the east pasture rising toward the ridge, grass grown tall and unkempt in the way of land that hasn't had animals on it in a long time. The stone wall was still there, mossy, settled, solid. Silas had built most of that wall himself over 4 summers, which Lorna had always considered one of the more astonishing facts of her grandfather's life. And she could still see it, the particular way he set the capstones at a slight angle to shed water. A small practical detail that had held those stones in place for 60 years. She stopped walking, because up ahead, just where the wall broke, the gate, it was the original ironwork. Black bars between 2 stone pillars her great-grandfather had set, before the war. The paint had long since gone to rust and patches. The hinges were dark with oxidation. But it was hanging true, and it was open, not ajar, not swinging loose in the wind, fully open, pushed all the way back against the left pillar, at a clean right angle to the road, the way you leave a gate when you're expecting somebody through it. Lorna stood in the middle of the county road and looked at it. She was not a superstitious woman. Silas had not raised her to be. He'd been practical straight down to the bone. A man who trusted what he could see and touch and measure, who had no patience whatsoever for vagueness. So it felt very strange to be standing on this road in the dying light of a November evening, feeling the quality of that open gate as something more than coincidence. Strange. And completely undeniable. He told her it would be open when she needed it. It was open. Whatever the explanation, those two facts were sitting right next to each other, and she could not make them stop. She walked toward it, and then she saw the rest. Tire tracks, fresh ones, cut into the soft edge of the lane. Where it met the road, the mud still holding a clean tread pattern, not weathered, not rained into softness. Days old, maybe less, and out in the east pasture, 30 yards up the slope, catching the last of the light, a stake, wooden, driven into the ground, orange plastic ribbon tied at the top, hanging dead still in the windless cold, and past it another one, and past that another. A line of them marching up her grandfather's pasture toward the ridge like somebody drawing a border on a map. Lorna stood at the open gate, with her hands at her sides. And she understood. The gate wasn't open for her. It was open because 3 men in a pickup had driven up here last week with a bundle of stakes and a roll of orange ribbon, and they'd swung it back against the pillar to get their vehicle through, and they hadn't bothered to close it behind them. Because why would you? You close a gate when the land belongs to somebody. Something went through her then. Fast and hot and total. And underneath it immediately a second thing, colder, quieter, older. So what if that's why it's open? Because Silas Halloway had never once in his life told her why a thing would happen. He'd told her that it would. And he had been a man who said very few things he didn't mean in 2 directions at the same time. The gate was open. He'd said walk through. He had not said walk through if the reason is a good one. She walked through. The lane was overgrown down the center, grass and weeds coming up through the gravel, but the wheel ruts on either side were clear enough to follow. She followed them, past the equipment shed, which had lost most of its roof, and was now 4 walls and a collection of rust. Past the kitchen garden, entirely reclaimed by whatever wanted it. Past the collapsed chicken coop that had housed a rotating population of bad-tempered hens throughout her entire childhood. And around the last curve, the house, it was standing. She hadn't been certain it would be. The roof looked intact from this angle the old tin Silas had been so proud of because it would outlast every one of them, and apparently it had. The porch was sagging on the left, where a support post had rotted through. 2 windows were broken. The white paint had peeled back to bare gray wood in most places. But the structure was there. Whole, upright, which was considerably more than she had any right to expect. She stood in the lane a long moment, taking in that particular feeling of returning to a place. After decades, memory and reality sitting side by side, not quite matching, not quite arguing. The house was smaller than she remembered. The yard was larger, and the oak by the south corner was enormous now. 3 times the tree she'd climbed at 11. She should have gone inside. It was almost dark and it was almost freezing, and there was a house right there with a roof on it. She didn't go inside. Something pulled her past it, around the east side, up the slope, toward a place she hadn't thought about in 20 years, and was suddenly, absolutely certain she needed to find. Behind the house, where the land rose sharp toward the upper pasture, there was a door, set into the hillside, low and wide, framed in heavy timber gone dark, with age to the color of old leather. The hill above it thick with cedar and scrub oak, roots grown down over the years and wrapped around the frame in places, like the hill had been slowly pulling the door into its keeping. The timber had held. Whatever wood her great-grandfather had chosen, when he cut this into the slope before the war, he'd chosen it right and set it properly, and 70-odd years of Kentucky weather had not managed to finish it. Silas had called it the cold room, a practical name for a practical space. But he'd called it other things too over the years depending on his mood, his thinking place, his quiet room. And once Lorna was maybe 14, and she'd asked him why he spent so much time up here, he'd looked at her with that level gaze and said, "Because it's the one piece of this property that belongs to me and nobody else." She had not understood that at 14. She understood it completely at 55. There was no lock. There'd never been a lock. Just a heavy iron bar dropped into a bracket on the frame. The bar was seized, rusted solid. She worked at it with both hands in the last gray light, and her fingers went stiff, and she braced a foot against the frame and pulled and nothing, and then it let go. With a grinding shriek that sent 2 starlings out of the cedar above her in a small explosion of complaint. She set the bar aside. She pulled the door. It was heavy, swollen with moisture the way old wood gets. It fought her for 1 second, 2, and then the seal broke, with a low sound like a held breath finally let go. Cool air came out, earth, cedar, and underneath those, faint but absolutely unmistakable lavender. The dried lavender her grandfather had kept in a bowl on this workbench for 50 years, because it kept the mice out of the seed stalk. Still here, still carrying some trace of itself, after 20 years in a sealed room in a hillside. Lorna put her hand flat against the door frame, and stood there, her eyes adjusted. The space went farther back into the hill than the entrance suggested. She remembered that now, the way you always forget the depth of it. Stone on 3 sides, heavy timber ceiling, packed earth floor, dry despite everything. Shelves along both walls, mostly empty, a few mason jars gone dark with age. A workbench at the back, where he'd started seedlings in late winter. A 3-legged stool, a lantern hook with nothing on it, and in the far corner on a low wooden platform that kept it up off the earth, a chest. She knew it immediately, and the knowing hit her somewhere behind the sternum. Physical, like a hand. It was the blanket chest, from the foot of his bed. The one that had sat in his room her entire childhood. The one she'd been told, at 7 years old, never to open, because it held things that were not for children. Dark oak, iron corner fittings, the wood gone nearly black. She crossed to it slowly. The earth floor was firm, and her footsteps made almost no sound at all. And she saw what was on it. A band of wax, dark red, thick, running the full length of the joint between the lid and the body, pressed and smoothed with care. The work of somebody who sealed this thing with the specific intention that it stay sealed, and set into the wax at the center the way you'd press a signet into a letter, a brooch. Small, oval, a painted miniature inside it, a face too small to make out in this light. The brooch her grandfather had worn on his coat lapel every winter for, as long as Lorna had been alive. His mother's. He'd never once explained it, and she'd never once asked. She reached out and touched the wax. Hard, dry, fully cured, and her hands started shaking, and she let them, because there was nobody in this hillside to see it. She found a flathead screwdriver on the workbench under a skin of rust. She worked the seal in sections. Careful, careful, going around the brooch instead of through it, because whatever else happened tonight, she was not going to be the one who broke that. The wax cracked away in dark red flakes. The lid came free. She lifted it, and the smell came up, cedar and lavender, and old cloth, and something faintly sweet she couldn't name. The chest was lined with cedar planks, and the cedar had done its job. The contents were wrapped in layers of muslin, yellowed, but whole. She lifted the first layer aside. A quilt, double wedding ring, blues and creams. The one off his bed. She set it aside like it was made of glass. Beneath it, wrapped separately in oilcloth and tied with twine, a bundle of papers. And beneath the papers, at the very bottom, she stopped breathing. A deed, the original deed to Halloway Ridge Farm, handwritten on legal stock, signed by Silas Halloway in March of 1955. 60 acres, the structures, water rights to the creek on the eastern boundary, mineral rights below, all of it straightforward, all of it exactly what she'd always understood to be true. And then, at the bottom, in different ink, added much later, in the shaky block capitals of an old man's hand, for Lorna. When she needs it, not if, when. She read it 3 times. And then she read the rest of it, the part underneath, and the floor of the world moved about 4 inches to the left. The farm and everything on it passes to her alone. The family trust holds nothing. I saw T.O. that in 1989, Lorna Ashcroft sat down on the packed earth floor of a room cut into a Kentucky hillside. In the dark, 20 miles from a gas station, where her husband had left her, that morning without a word. With her grandfather's handwriting in her hands. The family trust holds nothing. I saw to that in 1989. She sat very still for a long time. Then she set the deed on the quilt beside her. And she reached for the oilcloth bundle. The twine was stiff, but it came apart without much trouble. The cloth unfolded. Inside was a sheaf of papers held, with a binder clip, so rusted it left orange on her fingers. She worked the clip off. 3 letters. The top one was on plain paper, handwritten, in a hand she did not recognize, dated 2006, and it began, Mr. Halloway, I am writing this because I have nowhere else to send it, and because I cannot carry what I know, without putting it somewhere outside my own head. Lorna's hands went completely still. My name is Odessa Ward. For 11 years I was the records clerk at the county recorder's office. I processed a great many documents in those 11 years. I was good at my job and I was discreet, which is exactly why Harlan Voss trusted me enough to ask me to do something I should have refused. Lorna read it by the light of a butane lighter she'd found on the workbench, held in her left hand, until her thumb burned, then switched to the right. I processed a great many documents in those 11 years. Property transfers, liens, deed amendments, trust modifications, which is exactly why Harlan Voss trusted me enough to ask me to do something I should have refused. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2006. Odessa Ward remembered the day of the week because Tuesdays were when her supervisor drove to Frankfurt for the regional filing meeting, and everybody in that office knew it, and Harlan Voss knew it better than anybody because Harlan Voss made it his business to know when rooms were empty. She was 55 years old. She had a mortgage with 9 years left on it, and a certification that had taken her 4 years of night classes to earn. He came in at 2:10. Tall man, silver hair, a jacket because Harlan Voss wore a jacket in July. He set a folder on the counter and put both hands flat on either side of it, and he smiled the way he smiled at everyone, which was warmly and which meant nothing. Odessa, how's your mother? She passed in November, Mr. Voss. That's right, I knew that. He shook his head at himself. Forgive me. And he let that sit there for exactly the right length of time. Then he opened the folder. I've got a correction here. On what property? Halloway Ridge. She pulled it up. 60 acres out on the county road. Trust designation. Amended in 1989 to name a sole beneficiary, a granddaughter out of the county now married name. There's a beneficiary designation on this. That's the error. He said it the way you'd say that's the door. Simple. Settled. Already agreed upon by reasonable people. Old man got confused. Family's been trying to correct it for years. He's still living, isn't he? He's 89, which was not an answer, which was, she understood later, the entire architecture of Harlan Voss. He never lied. He just stood next to the truth and let you assume. He slid the document across. It should show as filed in 98, he said. That's when the family agreed to it. The paperwork just never got where it needed to go. And there it was. Odessa Ward looked at the document. She looked at the date stamp in her hand. She looked at the man on the other side of the counter, who sat on the county planning board, and had for 15 years, who knew her landlord, who golfed with the man who'd signed off on her certification. She was 55. 9 years left on the mortgage. I stamped it, she wrote. I backdated it. There is no version of this where I did not know what I was doing. I have been ashamed every single day since. 3 months later a title search came through on an adjacent parcel, and the numbers didn't line up. A 1989 amendment. A 1998 amendment reversing it. Filed by the same office. Stamped by the same clerk. Except the 1998 one had been physically entered into the book on a page that had been blank the previous spring, and Odessa Ward knew that because she was the one who kept the book. She went to Voss. He was in the parking lot behind the courthouse, leaning against his car with his coat over his arm because it was June. She told him what she'd found, and he listened, all the way through, nodding, patient, and then he said, "Odessa, who signed it?" Silence. "You did," he said. "Your stamp, your book, your handwriting on the margin note." He put his coat in the back seat. Very unhurried. "If this ever comes up, it comes up as clerical fraud by a records employee. That's the shape it has. That's the only shape it has. You brought me the document. I brought you a document. You entered it." He shut the car door. "I'd hate to see you lose your certification over a thing like this. I really would." And he'd said it pleasantly. That was the part Odessa Ward could never get past. He said it the way he said everything else. "I believed him completely," she wrote, "because I had watched him do exactly that to other people. I am sending this to you, Mr. Halloway, because it was your land and your granddaughter's inheritance, and you deserve to know what was done to it. I am not sending it to anyone else. Because I am frightened. I know that makes me a coward. I know she has no idea any of this happened. I know she may never know unless somebody tells her. I'm sorry I can't be braver than I am. But at least this letter will exist. At least somebody wrote it down." Odessa Ward. Lorna set the letter on the quilt. Slowly, with the deliberate care of a woman handling something that might shatter if she moved wrong. Even though it was paper. Even though it had been sitting in a wooden box in a hillside for 19 years, waiting for exactly this. Harlan Voss. She knew that name. Everyone in Cauldwell Hollow knew that name. The lighter had gone too hot to hold. She let it cool in her lap. Sat in the black dark of the cold room, with her back against her grandfather's chest, and her breath going out white in front of a face she couldn't see. And she said, out loud to nobody, "Okay." She slept in the house. It was more habitable than it had looked from the lane, which is the way of old farmhouses with good bones and better roofs. The back bedroom still had the iron bed frame. The mattress had seen better decades, but it was dry. And in the cedar chest at the foot of it she found blankets that smelled like the same lavender. She wrapped up in 2 of them, and lay in the dark listening to the house settle, those specific creaks and shifts a structure develops, when it's been standing empty long enough to have its own opinions. She thought she wouldn't sleep. She slept in 10 minutes, and she did not wake up until the light through the east window was full, and clean, and the birds in the oak were having their morning argument about territory. She lay still and took inventory. Feet, destroyed. Shoulders, filing a grievance. Hips, on the subject of that mattress, formal written complaint, copies to management. She was 55 years old. She had walked the better part of 20 miles on a ham sandwich. She had broken a wax seal her grandfather set with his own hands, and she had slept alone in an abandoned farmhouse. She felt, considering all of that, extremely functional. She got up. The kitchen pump still worked, which happens in old farmhouses with good wells and copper line, and she drank cold water out of her cupped hands, and put more of it on her face, and stood at the window looking out at the east pasture in the morning light. And there they were, the stakes, marching up her grandfather's slope in the sun. She counted 11 of them. She read the other 2 letters at the kitchen table, with the sun coming across. Errol Whitcomb, 2008. Blocky, careful handwriting. A man who did not write letters often and was taking pains with this one. He'd been at the courthouse in the spring of 2006 on an unrelated matter, a boundary question on his south fence, and he'd seen Harlan Voss coming out of the building with a folder under his arm. And Voss had the look. Errol described it exactly. The particular expression of a man who has just gotten away with something. He'd thought nothing of it, because Voss was always coming and going from official buildings with folders and expressions of self-satisfaction. It was his natural state, like weather. But 6 months later a landman out of Nashville came to see Errol about the creek corridor. Wanted to know about the parcels east of town. Wanted to know specifically about Halloway Ridge. And in the middle of a perfectly ordinary conversation, the man said something that Errol Whitcomb turned over in his mind for 3 days afterward. That one's back in a family trust now. Multiple stakeholders. Which makes it easier, honestly. No single owner to dig their heels in. Errol had nodded along. And then he'd driven home. And then he'd sat at his own kitchen table for 3 days. I did not go to anybody, he wrote. I want to put down why, so you know I'm not pretending it was something better than it was. Voss sits on the planning board. Has for 15 years. I lease 2 pieces of equipment through a company he holds a share in. A skid steer and a baler. I have 4 men whose wages depend on that equipment staying available to me. Ray has a boy with asthma. Delbert's wife works part-time at the school, and part-time is not enough. That is the arithmetic. I ran it. I'm not proud of the answer, but I saw what I saw, Silas. And I'm telling you because you're the only man I could think of who would understand both halves of it, what I saw, and why I didn't say it anywhere it would count. Lorna read that letter twice, and she noticed on the second pass that Errol Whitcomb had written down the names of the men. Ray, Delbert. He hadn't needed to. He'd made himself do it. Bernice Talley, 2011. Shortest of the 3. Typed, not handwritten. 6 years as a bookkeeper for Voss Property Management, and she described her departure only as circumstances that made staying impossible, which Lorna, who had been a bookkeeper herself for 30 years, recognized instantly as a sentence with a great deal underneath it. Bernice had access to the internal portfolio records, and she'd seen Halloway Ridge Farm listed there. Not under prospects, not under targets, under current holdings. I want to be precise about why that matters, she wrote, because if you don't work in this you might not see it. Prospect is something you'd like. A holding is something you have. He had it in the holdings column in 2010, 4 years after the amendment was filed. Which means for 4 years in his own office, in his own internal records, with his own accountants, that farm was already sold. It was just waiting on the timing. She'd taken a photograph of the page, with a disposable camera in the ladies' room on a Friday afternoon. The print was enclosed. Lorna unfolded it. Small, slightly blurred, absolutely legible. Halloway Ridge, 60 AC, current holdings. She held that photograph for a very long time. At 9 that morning she walked 1.5 miles to the Whitcomb place, and knocked on a door she hadn't knocked on since 1988. Errol Whitcomb was 71 years old, and he opened the door and he looked at her, and the color went out of his face. So fast she thought for a second she was going to have to catch him. You're the girl. I'm the girl. Silas's girl. Yes. He held the door frame. He's been dead 12 years, Errol said. I know. I wrote him a letter. I read it last night. And Errol Whitcomb, 71, 180 pounds of Kentucky farmer, a man who had not cried at his own father's funeral, put his hand over his mouth and stood in his doorway and did not say anything for a full 15 seconds. Then he said, "Come in. You'll want the phone." She used it in his kitchen, standing up because she couldn't sit. And while the line rang, Errol Whitcomb said something, over his shoulder, from the stove, in the offhand way a man says a thing he has never once thought was important. You know, my daddy used to run him up there. To the end. Lorna turned. Up where? The ridge. After he broke his hip and moved in with his cousin. Errol was pouring coffee neither of them would drink. Daddy'd drive him out maybe twice a year. Sit in the truck an hour and a half while Silas did whatever he did up that hill. Your father drove him. Vernon. Yeah. He shrugged. Last time was the summer before Silas passed. 2012. Daddy came home that evening and he was quiet all through supper. And I said, "What's got you?" And he said, Errol stopped. Set the pot down. He said, "The old man carried a box up that hill." The phone clicked over on the 4th ring. He never told me what was in it, Errol said. I never asked. Daddy died in 15. The lawyer's name was Francis Kerr. Small general practice in Clarksville. Recommended by Bernice Talley, whose number Errol had because Cauldwell Hollow was that kind of place and always had been. Lorna gave her the summary in about 4 minutes. Francis Kerr did not interrupt once. Then she asked 3 questions. Do you have the original 1955 instrument, or a copy? Original. Is the handwritten notation in the same ink as the body of the document? No. Different ink. Added later. Good. That's better. A pause. Papers. Last one. Where are those documents right now, physically, as we speak? Lorna looked out Errol Whitcomb's kitchen window at the ridge. In a wooden chest in a hillside. Move them today, Francis Kerr said. Not to the house. Somewhere off the property. Somewhere nobody would guess. You think somebody would? Mrs. Ashcroft. And the lawyer's voice did something then. It got very flat and very kind at the same time. You told me there are survey stakes in the pasture. That means there's a closing date on a calendar somewhere. Which means there is a man in this county who is about to find out that the thing he sold 20 years ago has a person standing on it. Silence on the line. Move them today, Francis Kerr said again. Lorna moved them that afternoon. She did not tell Errol where. Not because she didn't trust him. Because she'd read his letter, and she knew exactly what he'd already done once, with information that cost him something, and there was no reason on God's earth to make a 71-year-old man carry that twice. She made copies at the library in Cauldwell Hollow. Full set. Deed. Attorney's confirmation of the 1989 amendment. All 3 letters. The photograph. $12.40. Paid by Errol, who would not hear otherwise. She put the copies in an oilcloth bundle under her arm. And at 6:40, that evening she walked up Main Street toward the Anvil. Everybody in Cauldwell Hollow knew where Harlan Voss was on a Thursday night. He'd been going to the same place at the same hour for 30 years, a fact so established it had stopped being a fact, and become a feature of the landscape like the poorly timed light at Main and Fourth that had been wrong since 1987 and would apparently remain wrong forever. The Anvil had been a hardware store, and before that a feed supplier, and before that something nobody currently alive could remember. The sign over the door was the original. Dark wood, painted letters touched up. So many times they'd gone slightly swollen, like a word written over and over in the same spot. Lorna stopped outside and looked at herself in the window glass. Same clothes she'd put on in Vaughn Prentice's house on Tuesday morning. Wool coat, gray sweater, the walking shoes which had done 19 miles and were making no secret of it. Her hair had come partly loose from where she'd pinned it. She looked, she thought, exactly like a woman who had been left at a gas station and had walked most of the way since. There was nothing to be done about that. She tucked the hair back, straightened the sweater, shifted the bundle under her arm, and she pushed the door open. Warm, old wood, spilled beer, 20 years of the same friar, 30-odd people at tables in 2s and 4s, and at the big round table in the back corner, the one that might as well have had a brass plate on it, 5 men and Harlan Voss. He was talking when she came in, gesturing with one hand the way he did when making a point he considered generous. He saw her when she was halfway across the room, and she watched it land. The pause, the recalibration, the composure sliding back into place inside of a second and a half, which was fast, which she noted, which told her something about how many times he'd had to do it. He knew who she was. She'd known he would. Cauldwell Hollow was not large, and Lorna had lived here across 2 marriages and a childhood. What he did not know, she could see it plainly, was what she was carrying. She stopped at the edge of the table. The conversation died. 5 men looked at her with the specific attention of people who can feel that something is about to happen and have not yet worked out what. Mrs. Ashcroft. Voss, in the tone of a man extending a courtesy he doesn't feel. This is a surprise. Can we help you with something? You can. She set the deed on the table. I'd like to talk about Halloway Ridge. She laid them out one at a time. The 1955 deed, her grandfather's handwriting facing him. The 1989 attorney's confirmation. Odessa Ward's letter. Errol Whitcomb's letter. Bernice Talley's letter. And last, square in the middle, turned so he could read it right side up, the photograph. She did it slowly, in a line, with the methodical care of a woman who had spent 55 years learning that patience is the only kind of power available to people who don't have any other kind. The table was very quiet. Voss looked at the papers without touching them. The retired judge beside him leaned forward. then leaned back. The county commissioner at the far end was not looking at the documents at all. He was looking at Voss. "That property's been in a family trust for decades," Voss said. And his voice was still controlled. But something had gone out from underneath it, and what was left was thinner. "The record's clear. The record includes a fraudulent amendment you had filed in 2006. Lorna's voice came out level, which surprised even her. "Backdated to 1998. Processed by a clerk you threatened in a parking lot behind the courthouse in June of that year, while you were putting your coat in your car." The commissioner pushed his chair back from the table. Not far, but he pushed it back. "That farm has been mine since my grandfather died," she said. "You knew that because you'd seen the '89 amendment. That's why you needed the other one." Voss said nothing. His hands were flat on the table. "I'm not asking for an explanation," Lorna said. "I have the explanation. It's sitting in front of you." She began gathering the papers back into the oilcloth. Same unhurried care with which she'd laid them out. "You've had a good long run," she said quietly. 30 years of Thursday nights at this table, with men who think you're somebody worth sitting next to." She folded the cloth. "That's not nothing." She tucked it under her arm. "But it was built on what you took from other people. And somewhere behind whatever you tell yourself about it, I think you've always known that." She looked around the table at the 5 of them. "I'm sorry to interrupt your evening," she said, and she meant it completely. Then she turned and walked back out, through the amber light and the smell of old wood, and out into the November cold. And here is where Lorna Ashcroft made her one mistake. She thought that was the end of it. Took Harlan Voss 41 hours. Saturday, 9:15 a.m. A Cauldwell County Sheriff's deputy came up the lane. Polite, apologetic even. Complaint of criminal trespass on a parcel held by Meridian Land Holdings LLC. He wasn't arresting anybody. He was just serving paper. She had to understand he was just serving paper. "Whose company is Meridian?" The deputy looked at his boots. "Ma'am, I just served the paper." Saturday, 2:40 p.m. The roofing contractor called Errol Whitcomb's phone, because that was the number she'd left. The call lasted 20 seconds. "Something's come up. Can't do the job. Sorry." Click. Monday, 10 a.m. The bank in Clarksville, where Lorna had gone to open an account in her own name for the first time since 2016, needed additional documentation. And then additional documentation to support the additional documentation. And the young woman behind the desk kept saying, "I'm so sorry," in a tone that meant somebody made a phone call and it wasn't me. Tuesday, Francis Kerr called with the real one. "Sit down. I'm standing in a field." "Then keep standing. There's a consent instrument." "A what?" Dated April 2006. 2 weeks after the amendment was recorded. "It's a written consent from the beneficiary of record, acknowledging the reversion of the property to the family trust, and waiving any claim." Lorna's mouth had gone dry. Beneficiary of record. "Yes, that's me. Yes, Francis." She heard her own voice go strange. "I never signed anything about that farm. Not once. Not in my entire life." "I believe you. In 2006 I was living in Bowling Green with a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I did not know that farm had a beneficiary at all. Mrs. Ashcroft. I didn't know until Thursday night. Francis. I didn't know until I broke the wax off a box." "Lorna." She stopped. "I believe you," Francis Kerr said. "But the signature is going to have to be disproved, which means until it is, his lawyers get to stand in a courtroom and say you knew. And a judge will have to decide who's more likely to be lying." Silence. "There's something else," the lawyer said. "Of course there is. I pulled it this morning. Lorna, it's a good signature." "Meaning what?" "Meaning it doesn't look like a forgery. It looks like your hand." Wednesday night somebody came up the ridge. She heard the truck at 1:40 in the morning. No headlights. Engine cut halfway up the lane and rolling the rest. She did not go outside. She sat on the floor of the back bedroom with her back against the wall beside the window, and she watched a flashlight beam go around the side of the house, and up the slope, and she listened, and after 11 minutes she heard the sound she was waiting for. With splitting, the cold room door, they were in there 4 minutes. Then the flashlight came back down the hill fast, much faster than it went up, and the truck door shut soft, and the engine turned over and it rolled back down the lane in the dark. In the morning she went up and looked. The door frame was split along the bracket. The chest was open, lid thrown back, contents on the floor. The quilt had been kicked into the corner. The muslin was torn, and the brooch, her great-grandmother's brooch, the one Silas had pressed into red wax with his own thumb when he was 95 years old, was lying face down in the dirt. Lorna knelt and picked it up, wiped it on her sleeve, held it in her fist, and she stood alone in a broken room in a hillside, and said, out loud, in a voice that did not sound like hers, "You put your hands on his box." Everything up to that moment had been about a farm. Nothing after it was. The originals had never been there. They'd been in a lockbox at the Clarksville branch since Friday morning, because a lawyer told a woman to move them, and the woman had been raised by a man who did not require telling twice. Thursday, Frances Kerr called at 7 in the morning. "You need to come to the office." "Is it bad?" "It's not bad. It's..." A sound like she was holding paper up to a window. "Lorna, I've been doing property work for 22 years, and I have never once said this sentence to a client. I need you to sit down for the financial disclosures." Lorna sat down on a porch step that was still missing a support post. "Go. Prentice Equipment Repair. Your husband's shop." "What about it?" It carried $41,000 in debt across 3 instruments, 2 equipment notes and a line of credit. He'd been rolling it over since 2019. "I did his books until 2022. I know exactly what he owed." "Then you'll want to know it was retired in full on September 19th of this year." The porch step went very far away. "Retired," Lorna said. "Paid off." "Cleared. By a payment from an entity called Cauldwell Holdings, which is a subsidiary of Meridian Land Holdings, LLC. Which is Voss. Which is Voss." Lorna looked out at the pasture, at the orange ribbons hanging dead still. "When's the closing?" she said. "How did you..." "When is it, Frances?" "Papers. November 30th, Frances Kerr said. Here's what Lorna did next. She did not scream. She did not throw anything. She did not call Von Prentice and give him the satisfaction of hearing what he'd done to her voice. She sat on a broken porch step in the cold, and she went back through Tuesday morning 1 frame at a time. The way he'd said, "Go get us coffee." Not "Do you want coffee?" Not "I'll get it." "Go get us coffee. 2 cups." So she'd have both hands full. Her phone charging on the counter, which he had plugged in. Actually, she remembered it now, remembered him saying, "You're at 8%, Han," the night before, and her thinking distantly that it was the first considerate thing he'd done in a year. Her wallet in the bag on the back seat. 40 miles from home. 20 miles from the ridge. In November, 11 days before a closing. He hadn't left her because he was cruel. He'd left her because she was inventory. Because a man needed a woman with no phone, no money, no vehicle, and no address for a specific number of weeks, and there was a shop with $41,000 of debt on it, and the 2 facts had found each other. 9 years. She'd cooked 1,100 dinners for a man who sold her for the price of a skid steer and a line of credit. And the strangest part, the part she'd tell Frances Kerr about months later, the part nobody ever believed, was that she started laughing. Alone, on a porch step, in an empty field, because it was so cheap. Because if you're going to sell your wife, you'd think you'd hold out for more than $41,000. She laughed until her ribs hurt, and then she stopped and wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up. There was still the signature. Frances found the answer on a Tuesday. She had a document examiner in Louisville, retired postal inspector, did work for insurance companies, and she'd sent him the 2006 consent instrument alongside 11 verified samples of Lorna's handwriting, from tax filings and a mortgage application. He called Frances back in 90 minutes, which she said was the fastest turnaround she'd had in a decade. Francis put him on speaker. "Ma'am, did you sign this document?" "No." "I believe you. Francis says it looks like my hand." "It does. That's what I want to talk to you about." Papers shuffling. A forgery has hesitation in it. Pen lifts. Slow starts where somebody's copying a shape instead of writing a word. This has none of that. This was written at speed. By somebody who wasn't copying. Then how? Because it isn't a forgery of your signature, Mrs. Ashcroft. Somebody else's signature that happens to look like yours. The line went quiet. "That happens," he said. "In exactly one situation in my experience." Lorna already knew. She knew before he said it. Because there was one other person on this earth who had learned to write in the same kitchen, from the same man on the same lined tablet paper, at the same scarred table. One other person who made the same looping capital H. One other person whose maiden name was Halloway. "Family," the examiner said. "Somebody taught to write by the same hand you were." Francis pulled the signature block. The consent instrument was signed L. Halloway, styled as authorized representative of the Halloway Family Trust. Not Lorna Ashcroft. L. Halloway. And the notary log for that day in April 2006 was still on file at the county, because Odessa Ward had been meticulous even while she was being coerced, and it listed the presenting party's name in full. Francis read it out loud over the phone. Lorna stood in her grandfather's kitchen, with the receiver against her ear, and looked at a hairline crack in the plaster she had known since she was 9 years old. "Roselle," she said. "Your sister." "My sister." "Lorna." $5,000. Because Francis had already read her the wire. Because it was right there on the same page. She signed away 60 acres, and my grandfather's grave for $5,000. We don't know what she was told. No. She may have thought. She's 58, Francis. She's not a child. Lorna's hand had gone white on the receiver. She stood at that funeral. She stood 4 feet from me at that funeral in 2013, and she held my arm. Silence. And she'd already done it. Roselle Halloway had not spoken to her sister in 19 years. Not a fight. There'd never been a fight. That was the thing Lorna had never been able to explain to anybody. Not to Emmett, not to her children, not to herself at 3 in the morning. There was no rupture. There was just a slow lengthening. Calls that stopped getting returned. Holidays with a reason attached. A birthday card that came in June for a March birthday and then eventually didn't come at all. Lorna had spent 19 years assuming she'd done something, turning it over, auditing herself, going back through conversations from 2005 and 2006 looking for the sentence, the moment, the thing she'd said wrong. She'd built an entire private architecture of guilt out of nothing. And now she stood in a cold kitchen and understood. Roselle hadn't pulled away because she was angry. Roselle had pulled away because she couldn't look at her. 19 years of distance. Not a wound. A hiding place. Lorna set the receiver down in its cradle. Very gently. And outside the window, out in the east pasture, 11 orange ribbons hung motionless in the gray light, over ground that had been waiting 60 years for somebody to come home and claim it. 11 days until the closing. And the only witness who could prove any of it was a 74-year-old woman in a care facility 2 counties over, who, 3 days later, when Lorna finally found her and sat down across from her and said her name, looked up with perfect clarity and smiled and said, "Mama, you came back. Mama, you came back." Odessa Ward was 74 years old, and she was sitting by a window in a common room that smelled like coffee and floor wax, and she was looking at Lorna Ashcroft with her whole face lit up. Lorna sat down. Slowly, because here is what nobody tells you about walking into a room to save your life and finding out the room has moved. "Mrs. Ward, you cut your hair." "Mrs. Ward, my name is Lorna." And Odessa's face did something terrible then. It flickered, like a bulb about to go. The light in it dimmed, and came back and dimmed again, and her hands came together in her lap, and she said, in a completely different voice, "Oh, It's all right. Oh, I've done it again. It's all right. I do that. She was folding a paper napkin now. Over and over. Smaller and smaller. They tell me I do that. Lorna reached across and put her hand on the woman's hand and stopped the folding. Odessa, I'm going to say a name, and if you don't know it, that's fine, and I'll leave and I won't come back. The old woman looked at her. Harlan Voss, Lorna said, and every single thing in that face changed. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she stood up, 74 years old, one hand on the arm of the chair, up on her feet, without help, and she said, "Come with me." It was in her closet, a shoebox, under 2 winter coats she would never need again in a building with central heat. Rockport, women's 8, Navy. She put it on the bed and stood back from it like it might go off. 19 years, she said. Lorna opened it. Inside, a photocopy of the 2006 amendment, front and back. A photocopy of the page from the record book, the original page before the entry went in, blank where the 1998 filing was supposed to have been. Her own contemporaneous handwritten note, dated and signed the same June day she'd confronted him behind the courthouse. And a small spiral notebook, times, dates, every conversation she'd had with Harlan Voss for 11 years. Lorna's hands were not steady. "You kept a log." "I was a records clerk," Odessa Ward said. "It's what I am." And then she sat down on the edge of her own bed, and she looked at the wall, and she said the thing Lorna would carry for the rest of her life. "I've been keeping it for somebody to come." A breath. "And then I started forgetting who I was keeping it for." Francis Kerr got the emergency hearing set for November 25th, 5 days before the closing. It took a call to a circuit judge who owed her a favor from 2019 and a temporary restraining order to buy the days, and Francis did not explain how she got either. "I have to tell you the exposure," she said, "because I'm not going to be the lawyer who didn't. Tell me. Odessa Ward is our case. Without her, we have 3 letters from 20 years ago, 2 of which are hearsay, and a photograph a bookkeeper took in a bathroom. And with her, we have a living witness to the fraudulent instruction, with contemporaneous documentation." Francis paused. "If she's lucid that morning. And if she isn't? Then Meridian closes on the 30th, and you spend the next 4 years in civil litigation you can't afford." Lorna looked out the window of the lawyer's office at Clarksville in the rain. "There's the other thing," Francis said. "Roselle. If she doesn't come voluntarily, I subpoena her. And a hostile witness who's protecting herself is worth about half of a willing one." A pause. "You need to go see your sister." "No." "Lorna." I said no. She went back to the ridge, and she did not go see her sister. Instead, she went up to the cold room to fix the door frame, because her hands needed something, and because a woman who has been raised right does not leave a broken bracket through a winter. She pulled the split boards off the frame. She pulled the chest out from the wall to get behind it, and that was when she heard it. A shift, something moving inside the empty chest. The cedar lining had come loose on the bottom left panel. 200 pounds of oak dragged across a dirt floor by whoever broke in here had knocked a board out of its rabbet, and behind that board there was a gap of maybe half an inch between the cedar and the oak. And in the gap, an envelope. Lorna sat down on the dirt floor for the second time in her life in that room. Lorna. That was all it said. Block capitals. An old man's hand. The same hand as the deed. She held it for a full minute before she opened it. "Lorna, if you are reading this, then you found the box, which means something has gone wrong in your life, which I am sorry for, and could not prevent. I am 95 years old. Vernon Whitcomb drove me up here this morning, and I made him wait in the truck, because I did not want a witness to how long it took me to get up that hill. 22 minutes. Write that down somewhere. It used to be 40 seconds. Here is what I need to say to you. In 1961, my brother Arlie sold 19 acres of this place out from under me, the east strip along the creek. He had the authority to do it on paper, and he did not have the right to do it in any other way, and he did it, and he took the money to Ohio. I did not speak to him for 9 years. 9 years, Lorna. I want you to sit with that number. And I will tell you exactly what those 9 years cost. They cost me a brother. They cost me his funeral, which I did not attend, and have regretted for 40 years. And every single day of those 9 years I paid rent on a room in my own head that Roselle Halloway was living in free of charge. That is the part nobody tells you. A grudge is the only thing in this world you have to feed. It does not feed itself. You get up in the morning and you carry it downstairs and you set it at the table and you give it the best part of your day every day for as long as you decide to keep it. And the person who wronged you does not pay 1 cent of it. I forgave Arlie in 1970. Not because I am a good man. I forgave him because I did the arithmetic and I could not afford him anymore. Now listen to me. Forgiving is not the same as forgetting, and it is not the same as letting somebody back in the house. I forgave my brother. I never gave him a key. You can hold the wound and hold the walking forward in the same 2 hands. One does not cancel the other. Whoever told you that you have to choose was selling something. There has been something done to this land, and to you. I have put in this box what I could get my hands on. It is not enough, and I know it is not enough. I am 95 and my lawyer is dead, and the people who could speak are frightened, and I could not find a way to tell you. That would not make you carry it for years, before you needed to carry it. So I did the only thing left, which is what your great-grandfather did, when he cut this room into the hill. I put it somewhere it would keep, and I trusted you to come. The gate will really be open when you need it. I meant that in both directions, and I always have. Do not stand outside wondering. Grandpa. S.H. Summer 2012. Lorna Ashcroft sat on the floor of a hillside in Kentucky and cried for the first time since the funeral. Not for the farm. Not for Vaughn. For a 95-year-old man who took 22 minutes to climb a hill he used to take in 40 seconds. So that a woman he would never live to see arrive would have something waiting for her. She drove to Roselle's the next morning. Errol Whitcomb's truck. Errol Whitcomb insisting. A small brick house in Radcliffe with a wheelchair ramp on the side that Lorna had not known about because there were 19 years of things Lorna had not known about. Roselle opened the door. 58. Gray now. Thinner than she should have been. And her face when she saw who it was. That was the whole story right there in 1 second. That was the answer to 19 years of Lorna auditing herself at 3 in the morning. Because Roselle Halloway did not look surprised. She looked relieved. You found it. Yes. Roselle's hand came up to the doorframe. I'm going to ask you one question, Lorna said. Okay. And then I'm going to leave, and what you do after that is yours. Okay. Were you going to let me die not knowing? Roselle Halloway made 2 cups of coffee that neither of them drank. Then she talked for 40 minutes. Here's what it came to. March 2006. She was 39. She was 6 weeks out from a divorce she hadn't seen coming, and 11 days from an eviction she had. 2 kids, car with a bad transmission, and a very kind man from town called her about a family matter. He came to her apartment, brought a folder, sat at her kitchen table and told her that old Silas was 89 and getting confused, that he'd made a mistake on the paperwork years back, and the whole family wanted it put right. He never once said your name, Roselle said. He said the beneficiary. He said the paperwork. She was looking at her hands. He said it was a formality. He said it was a piece of ground nobody had walked on in years. And the 5,000? He called it an administrative fee. Roselle laughed. Once. Ugly. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to call it, and then I remember deciding not to think about it. You signed L. Halloway. Because that's my name, Lorna. Roselle Lynn Halloway. I've signed L. Halloway on every school form and every lease since 1985 because Roselle is a mouthful and I was in a hurry my entire life. And Lorna sat with that. Because it was true. Because she'd seen that signature on birthday cards for 40 years and never once thought about it. Because the single piece of evidence that had nearly destroyed her was not a forgery at all. It was a woman in a hurry who did not read the page. I didn't read it, Roselle said. I want to be clear. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I was tricked. I was told things that weren't true and I didn't read it, and those are two different crimes and I committed both. She looked up. 3 months later I understood what I'd done. And you never called me. No. 19 years, Roselle. I picked up the phone in 2009. Her voice broke on the number. I got as far as the 4th digit. And I put it down. And I have picked up that phone maybe 200 times since, and I have never once gotten past the 4th digit because there is no sentence, Lorna. There's no sentence a person can say. Lorna stood up. There is. She went to the door. It's I did it and I'm sorry. She put her hand on the knob. That's the sentence. It's been available the entire time. And she left. She was 2 miles down the road when Errol Whitcomb said, without taking his eyes off the highway, "She'll come." You don't know that. No. He shifted down for the curve. But I know what 19 years of not saying a thing feels like. From the inside. And I wrote a letter about it, and hid it in a box, same as everybody else in this county. He was quiet a mile. Then he said, I'm testifying, by the way. Errol Voss pulls the skid steer. I rent from Hardin County, and I pay 11% more. Both hands on the wheel. Ray's boy is 26 now. Delbert retired in 2019. He glanced over. I've been carrying men who don't work for me anymore, Lorna, for 11 years. Turns out that's what a reason does when you stop checking on it. It stays the same size in your head. November 25th, 9:00 a.m. Cauldwell County Courthouse. 2nd floor. A room with bad light and worse chairs and a radiator that clanked like something trapped. Harlan Voss came in at 4 minutes to 9 with 2 lawyers from Louisville and a coat over his arm. 78 years old. Silver. Straight-backed. And he shook hands with the bailiff on his way in. Both hands held the grip a beat longer than necessary, because that's what he'd always done, because it had always worked. Odessa Ward came in on the arm of a nurse's aide at 9:20. Lorna did not breathe from the moment that door opened until the moment Odessa's eyes found her across the room. And Odessa Ward, 74 years old, in a navy dress, and her mother's earrings, looked at Lorna Ashcroft and said, clear as a bell, across a courtroom, Good morning, Mrs. Ashcroft. It was a good day. God help them all, it was a good day. She testified for 51 minutes. She named the date. She named the hour. She named the fact that her supervisor drove to Frankfurt every Tuesday, and that Harlan Voss had never once come to that counter on any other day of the week in 11 years, not one time, and she knew that because she had written it down. She produced the notebook. She produced the photocopy of the blank record book page. Voss's lawyer went after her memory. Of course he did. Gently at first, then less so. Mrs. Ward, is it true that you were diagnosed? Mrs. Ward, do you have difficulty? Mrs. Ward, isn't it possible that you're confusing? And Odessa Ward folded her hands on the rail in front of her and said, Young man, I am forgetting my whole life. The room went dead silent. I forgot my sister's name last Thursday. I am going to forget this room. I will probably forget this morning by Christmas. She lifted her chin. I have not forgotten what he said to me in that parking lot, because I have been carrying it every day for 19 years so that I would still have it when somebody finally came to ask. She looked at Harlan Voss for the first time. I kept it for her, she said. You can have everything else. Errol Whitcomb testified for 11 minutes. He said the thing about the landman from Nashville. He said the thing about the folder and the expression. And then Voss's lawyer asked him, smugly, briskly, as a throwaway, why a man would wait 17 years to say any of this. And Errol Whitcomb said, because I was scared of him. Just that, flat, loud, into a room with 40 people in it. I've been scared of that man since 1994, and so has half this county, and everybody in here knows it, and nobody's ever said it out loud in a building like this one. He looked around the room. So there, somebody said it. Bernice Talley entered the photograph. Francis Kerr entered the 1955 deed, the 1989 amendment, and the attorney's confirmation letter. And at 2:15 p.m. The doors at the back opened, and Roselle Halloway walked in. She had not been subpoenaed. Francis had drawn one up. Lorna had told her to hold it. She walked up the center aisle in a coat she'd owned since 2011, and she took the stand, and she stated her name, and she was sworn. And Francis Kerr asked her one question. "Mrs. Halloway, did you sign the April 2006 consent instrument?" "I did." "Were you authorized to?" "No." "Did you read it?" "No." "Why not?" And Roselle Halloway looked at the back wall of a courthouse in the county where she was born. "Because I was 39 years old, and I was about to be evicted," she said. "And a man I trusted told me it was nothing. And I wanted so badly for it to be nothing that I did not look." Her lawyer had told her not to say the next part. She said it anyway. "I took $5,000. I knew inside of 3 months exactly what I'd done. And I said nothing for 19 years because I was a coward about it, and my sister spent all 19 of those years thinking she'd done something to make me stop calling." She turned her head, found Lorna in the second row. "You didn't," she said. "You never did anything. It was me the whole time." Harlan Voss's lawyers moved to strike. The judge denied it, and Lorna Ashcroft sat in a courtroom and watched her sister put herself in criminal jeopardy on a Tuesday afternoon, with no deal, no immunity, and no lawyer worth the name, which is a thing that is very easy to describe, and which no amount of describing gets right. The court voided the 2006 amendment as fraudulently obtained on December 2nd. The 1989 instrument was restored. The meridian closing was enjoined and then abandoned because a buyer will walk from anything once a judge uses the word fraud in a written order. The county attorney opened a file on Harlan Voss the same week. He resigned from the planning board on December 9th. 31 years. The newspaper ran 2 paragraphs. Francis Kerr asked her, the day the order came down, whether she wanted to press for charges against her sister. There was an argument for it. There was leverage in it. Lorna said no, not out of softness. She wants that understood. She'd read the letter. She'd run the numbers, and she could not afford him. But she asked for one thing. She asked Francis to petition the court to enter a finding, in writing in the record on the public file, that Odessa Ward had acted under documented coercion. That she was not a participant. That her name was clean. The judge granted it on December 4th. Lorna drove the certified copy over herself. 2 counties, 90 minutes each way, in the sleet, and she sat in a common room that smelled like coffee and floor wax, and she read it out loud, all 4 paragraphs, to a 74-year-old woman who listened to every word. And when she finished, Odessa Ward said, "Read it again." So she read it again. Vaughn Prentice came up the lane on the 18th of December. Lorna was on the porch. New support post, set the week before, still raw pine against the gray. He got out of the truck. That same truck. He'd rehearsed it. She could see the rehearsal on him like a bad suit. "Lorna. Vaughn. You look. Don't." He stopped. Started again. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." About the 41,000? And there it was. The exact moment he understood that she knew. His whole face came apart and got put back together wrong. "Now, I don't know what you think you." September 19th. She set down the coffee. Cauldwell Holdings. Which is Meridian. Which is Voss. "Lorna. 2 cups of coffee, Vaughn." He blinked. "So I'd have my hands full," she said. He didn't say anything, which was, in the end, the most honest thing he ever did. "I want you to know something," Lorna said, and her voice was not raised, and it was not shaking. "I'm not angry. I thought I would be. I've had a month to work up to it, and it never came." She stood up. "You sold me for $41,000. She came down 1 step, and here's what I keep landing on. It's not that you did it. Another step. It's that you undersold." He stared at her. 9 years of dinners. 9 years of your books, for free, every quarter. 9 years of a woman who never once asked you a hard question, because she was too tired to want the answer. She stopped in front of him. You should have gotten more. That's genuinely all I feel about it. Poor negotiating. Lorna, I'm not buying myself back. She said it very gently. That was the thing that broke him. The gentleness. Go home, Vaughn. And she turned around and went inside and shut the door. She did not watch the truck go. She'd already done that once. Tobin came up on 3 weekends in December. He was 33 years old, and he showed up the first Saturday at 7 in the morning with a circular saw and a case of screws and no speech prepared, which Lorna appreciated more than any speech he could have given. They rebuilt the porch. They talked about joists. They talked about weather. They talked about whether the oak needed taking back off the roofline. They did not talk about the 9 years. They said the whole thing anyway, both of them with tools in their hands. On the last Sunday, loading up in the dark, he stood by the truck a minute too long. He left you at a gas station. He did. And you walked. I did. Tobin looked at the house. 20 miles. 19.4. Des looked it up. And her son laughed, a wrecked, wet laugh, and got in the truck. Cordelia sent money for the roof. No call. No note. A transfer with the memo line roof and nothing else, which, from Cordelia, was a novel, and Lorna understood every word of it. Merritt drove up one Sunday in January, with 2 kids under 7, who spent 4 hours running the fence line and terrorizing Errol Whitcomb's cattle. Lorna let them come. She didn't pretend the 9 years hadn't happened. She didn't paper over the accounting of what had been given and what had been withheld. But she let them come, because there was a letter in a frame on the kitchen wall now, where she could see it while the coffee went, and it had been very clear about what a closed door costs. By January the kitchen had a working stove. By February the cold room had new hinges, a new frame, and a bracket. Lorna set herself with a chisel and considerable swearing. The brooch went back in the chest. Not sealed. She thought about it. She decided against it. Some things you leave able to be opened. And in February, a woman from town named Alma Ketchum knocked on the door with a wedding dress that needed taking in 3 inches because word travels through the particular efficient network of a small county, and word was that the Halloway girl was back and she could sew. Which was true, because a man had taught her on a treadle machine in the front room in 1982, and she'd built on it for 43 years, and it had never once occurred to her that it was a skill rather than just a thing she could do. Alma Ketchum was the first. By March there were 11. Roselle started coming on Saturdays in February. She never called ahead. She'd just be there around 10 in the doorway with something, a pie, a box of screws, once an entire ham for reasons neither of them ever established. They didn't talk about 2006. They didn't need to. It had been said in a courthouse in front of 40 people, and there was nothing left in it to say. They shelled beans. They fixed the fence along the creek. They argued about whether their grandmother's cornbread had sugar in it, which is a thing sisters can argue about for 4 decades without resolving. Roselle didn't ask to be forgiven. That's the part Lorna respected. She just showed up, week after week. And that turns out to be what it looks like most of the time. Not a scene. Not a speech. Somebody who keeps arriving. On a Saturday morning in late March, Lorna Ashcroft stood in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee and looked out at 60 acres of Kentucky. The creek was up with snowmelt. She could hear it from the house. The starlings were back in the cedar over the cold room door. The oak by the south corner was budding, and the east pasture had a new fence line where the old posts had rotted through and no orange ribbons anywhere on it because she'd pulled every one of those stakes herself in December and burned them in the yard and stood there while they went. 60 acres that had waited through 20 years of an empty house, through 19 years of somebody else's fraud, through 9 years of a marriage that turned out to have a price tag on it, and one long November day of walking. She thought about her grandfather taking her hand between both of his on a porch in 1995, with a plate of birthday cake between them. He'd meant it as comfort, probably, the kind of thing you tell somebody you love so they know there's always a place. But he'd also meant it literally, because that was Silas Halloway, and he had very seldom in 96 years said a thing he didn't mean in both directions at once. The gate was open. It had been opened for the wrong reason by the wrong men on the wrong errand. And she had walked through it anyway, which is, when you get down to it, the only part of any of this that was ever up to her. She finished the coffee. Then she got the wire brush and the can of black enamel out of the shed, and she walked down the lane in the March sun, and she spent 4 hours on her knees taking 60 years of rust off her great-grandfather's ironwork. Painted it, 2 coats, stood back and looked at it, black and clean, and hanging true on posts a man had set, before the war. And then Lorna Ashcroft, 55 years old, who had been left at a gas station with no phone and no wallet and no explanation, and who had walked 19.4 miles to find out what she was actually made of, pushed that gate all the way back against the stone pillar. The way he used to leave it. And she went inside. And she got to work.